Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name's Christiane Lamb. I'm the Chief Operations Officer at Vincents, and I'm joined by Terri Reed, our HR Manager. One of the most rewarding aspects of business ownership, I think, or of management, is seeing how those we work with develop and grow with our business and also personally. But having said that, it's also one of the most significant areas of challenge. And through my years of working here, I've noticed that dealing with people is always a challenge that people aren't quite aware of dealing with in many instances. So today we'll be looking at how through best HR practice we can maximise the outcomes of the employment relationship and also minimise those challenges that people face. We won't be exploring any HR compliance issues today because that's too big an area for us in such a short period of time. And also we'll only be looking at an overview of most of the important aspects of the recruitment process, the retention process and the termination process. You're welcome to ask questions throughout the session and we will attempt to answer them at the conclusion. If we don't have time to do that, we will get back to you on a personal basis to respond to those questions. Also, at the end of the session, we'll ask for some feedback from you because we'd like to continue these sessions over the coming months, and we'd like to hear from you on those areas where you'd like more in-depth information and also areas that you have concerns with yourself. Okay. So Terri's going to speak now on the recruitment process.
So today's session we will start off with recruitment, where we'll work through position descriptions, interview options, sourcing candidates, developing vacancy advertisements, candidate selection, protecting the brand, conducting an interview, the selection process and making an offer, before we move through to retention and touching on onboarding, culture, KPIs, communication and engagement, and wrapping up with the termination process. So in terms of recruitment, I really feel the best place to start is with a clear idea of what you're seeking, and you can best do this through a position description. So if it's a new role, clearly that's something you'd be developing, but if you're replacing an existing role, then you would need to consider whether the position description you have on hand is still applicable to the role, because roles will evolve over time. But essentially, if it's a new PD, you'd be looking at wanting to put in the purpose of the role, so what they're there to do, the reporting lines, both upwards and downwards, so if they're responsible for other employees, who would that be? The title of the role, which is always very important to candidates. I know sometimes when we've progressed our careers and we've reached the top of the org chart, we're not as focused on title, but as people are commencing and coming through your business, the title can be very important to them. You do also need to identify at that stage what's in your budget, so what remuneration would you expect to pay for the role, and you should also take into account the required experience that the candidate would need to fill the role, so that's in terms of their practical experience and their educational qualifications. At this early stage of planning the recruitment, you should also be considering the timing and the interview format that you'll adopt. So keeping in mind that in many cases it can take at least 6 weeks to fill a role by the time you advertise and then conduct interviews and obviously review all the candidates. And also you'll need to establish who will conduct those interviews within your business. Some organisations are large enough that they have HR practitioners who can do that first stage of interviewing for you. In smaller organisations, it might be their supervisor along with the owner or manager of the business. So you need to identify who's best placed to do that. If you do have HR practitioners, I always recommend that the person who's going to be supervising them is certainly involved in that selection process when it comes to the interview. So make sure they're all available. You'd also need to consider the best approach, whether you want to do some video interviewing, which we've recently started adopting in our organisation, That allows you to see a far greater pool of candidates to select from, although you do need to be mindful that some people find that intimidating or might not have access to that kind of technology. You could elect a phone screen as well as a way of initially communicating with people and assessing their suitability for the role. If distance is an issue, you could choose to Skype as well. And you'd also need to slot into your process whether you're going to be conducting any psychometric testing or other testing for that role.
Terri just mentioned the 6-week process that it takes on average to recruit someone. Something that I think is always important to do and sometimes forgotten is to speak to your team and just let them know where you're at in the process, because quite often they're the people who are left to do those extra chores that have been left by the person that is no longer there if the person has moved on, and it can be quite a stressful time for them.
Absolutely. And then when we move through to selecting the candidates, keeping in mind your team as well, because you will be looking for a fit within your organisation. Not only do you need people who can actually do the job, but they need to be able to fit in with your organisational culture as well. When it comes to the candidates, when you first advertise the role, it's also good to consider who might be suitable internally that you could promote or transfer, but you do need to be cautious because you need to ensure that that person is suitable for the role and also capable to undertake the role so that they've had the right training and expertise to step into that role. Another good point is through referrals. So you might have a staff incentive program where you might pay them a bonus for referring someone. I'd always suggest that if you do that, that bonus is payable at the end of the trial period for the successful person, and both staff still need to be in your employ at that time. You could also consider using online platforms to source candidates. So in addition to, say, Seek, you could be using LinkedIn, and they have a recruiter tool that you can purchase for a fairly significant fee to help you with that search. But there's also industry bodies, there's universities and alumni, and there's always the print media, which has seen a decrease in recent times over online mediums. So once you've made those sort of pre-recruitment decisions, you need to start looking at actually writing a compelling ad. So we'd be looking then from the PD, making sure that we include the job title, some significant points of difference as well. So looking at your business, what separates you from everybody else? What makes your business fantastic to work for? Is it your staff? Is it your social activities? Has your business won awards? What stands you out from other people? Could it be your location even? Or free parking, that's another thing too. You know, sometimes businesses have attributes that other businesses don't, so including that in your ad is a definite benefit for you. Give as much information in the advert as you can about the job. So as I said, your location, even the duration of the role. Sometimes it might only be a contract. And in some cases you can say why the vacancy has come about as well. Include a remuneration range. There's been some media recently where they've talked about displaying the remuneration range so people know from the outset what that's going to be. I also know that some businesses prefer not to do that. In some online mediums you can use what's called a hidden salary range, so that it's only advertised at a certain range behind the scenes, and when people put in their job search criteria they say which range they're looking for. If your role's within that range, then it will come up on their job search. Try not to overload your job. You do need to be quite, your job advertisement, you do need to be quite succinct. So bullet points and less writing is always a good idea. Don't combine one advertisement for multiple roles. You're better off tailoring each ad for each role and making sure you use the right channels for that role. So if you were looking for graduates, you'd create a specific graduate ad, and then to universities, if it was a marketing role, you'd create a specific role for marketing, and you'd perhaps also reach out to marketing associations. And most importantly, make sure you proofread your ad, because this will be the first touch point that your future employees have with your organisation, so you do want to come across as professional as possible.
So on that, Terri, I would also suggest that we avoid cliched terms like think outside of the square, or using that very used term work-life balance. It is something that can actually make you just sound like you're just one of the mob without really meaning what you're saying. So the words of the ad are very important, as Terri says, for that first point of touch and the first feeling that that candidate will get of you.
So when it actually comes to selecting the candidate, you will often find you will either have an abundance of people apply for your role, or you'll have very few people apply for the role. In either case, you can identify the more genuine ones based on how they've addressed their application. I would typically be looking initially at their cover letter to ensure that's addressed to my firm and that it's addressing the right role that we have. But also the selection criteria, if you have published selection criteria in your ad where you've articulated specifically what you're looking for, perhaps in terms of experience and education, that the ad is, the candidate is actually addressing those criteria. When working through their resume, you'd want to make sure that they've detailed their past roles and their dates of employment and what responsibilities they might have had in those roles as well. I think another big giveaway is the attention to detail they've paid in their application. So if their application has a lot of grammar error or a number of other typos, that might be something that you need to consider how relevant that is for the role that you're looking for. It's at this stage, as I mentioned earlier, that your brand is really in the market now, so it's important to represent your best business self from that point onwards. Make sure you represent the business well in terms of acknowledging all applications, so that would be each and every application, even if they're not suitable for the role. If you're in the fortunate position to have software to help you do that, that makes it a lot easier because it would be automated. But if you're not, then I would recommend appointing someone to create a spreadsheet, enter each candidate's data so that you can create a mail merge and acknowledge all applicants, just stating that you've received their application and outlining what the next stage of the recruitment process would be. You could be crafting the response at that stage in terms of letting them know you'll only be responding to successful candidates, and that would cut down on some of your paperwork.
And that's something I think we hear as individuals all the time, where people go to the effort of applying for a role and they never hear anything ever again. And I think that, that's something, especially these days with the technology that we have to help us, that's something that's a huge no-no from my perspective. And also, you don't know who knows who in this world of very quick response and social media, and it doesn't take long for sort of negative comments to come rather than, to a very small period of writing back and letting people know that can change to a positive outcome for you.
In fact, on that, I was recently told, Christiane, by a graduate that there's a tool called Whirlpool, and candidates do go on there and exchange information about the firms and their recruitment practices. So it certainly does get around quickly. When it comes to actually booking interviews with the candidates, you might need to apply some flexibility around that. Sometimes, as I said earlier, they might not be local to you, so you might need to arrange for interviews outside of hours. They might need to have additional time to arrange for travel if they are coming from interstate and you wish to interview face-to-face. So keeping in mind that phone screening and Skype might also be a good option to ensure you get to everyone in a fairly timely way. Finally, we're getting through to the interview phase. I always like to make sure we welcome our candidates quite promptly when they come to see us, and I start with an icebreaker, which might be as mundane as about the weather, but just something to loosen up the tone of the interview and a little bit of a get-to-know-you chat. I would then move through to checking their understanding about the business and the role, having the position description handy so that they can read over that in more detail than what was published in the ad. And at that stage, just check to ensure that that is the kind of role they're seeking and that your business does represent what they believe it to be.
Actually, I do have an instance where when I was carrying out an interview some time ago, we did go through that, we did explain the role, and the applicant actually then decided at that point that it wasn't quite the role for her, and she excused herself and left. Now, to my mind, that was a really good response, because there was no point in her continuing on with it if it wasn't something for her. Sometimes things like that do happen at interview
So the next phase after that, assuming they stayed, would be to work through their resume. So have a chat about their previous roles and why they left and what they liked or disliked in those roles, even if they're not particularly similar to what you did, what you're offering, I should say, but just so that you're getting to know them a bit better and what makes them tick. I'd move on to then talking about their goals and where they'd like to be, their educational milestones, and what sort of technology or specific knowledge that they have that's relative to the role. Again, in terms of the getting to know you, you can also ask them about what they do for fun and their sports and their hobbies. I usually sort of wrap up by telling them a little bit more about our business again, so the cultural side and the social activities, things that I thought might attract them to our business, just to have a bit of an extra sell. You do need to be careful that you don't oversell. You shouldn't be telling them things that aren't true. You should always be honest about your business, including some of the things that you feel your business needs to improve on. Another good thing to do is to ask them some behavioural-based questions, so you can actually give them a scenario and ask them how would they respond to that, and that just helps you test their knowledge and get an idea if they're fit for the role again. Finally, at the very end of the process, I would be asking the candidates when they're available to start and how much notice they need to give, whether they've got any holidays planned, so that you know if you make them an offer and they can start in a month, but then they're going to be on holidays for a month in a few weeks' time, you might want to consider when the most appropriate time to start them is, and also asking them what their remuneration expectations are. After that, you're getting down to reflecting on your who's the best candidate for the role. So you would have completed all your interviews. You may have interviewed 2 to 5 people, depending on the role and the quality of the candidates that came through. So I'd be reflecting then on how they came through at the interview, how they best met the selection criteria. Do I feel they're a good fit for our business? And if there's any additional testing, you'd also be considering how they went in those tests. Once you've narrowed it down to 1 or 2 people, you'd then move into reference checking. So you'd contact the candidate and ask them if you can proceed with reference checks and who you have permission to speak with. Keeping in mind that until a candidate becomes an employee under the Freedom of Information Act, they can access the records that you've created based on them, their application, your interview notes, and also the reference checks that you conduct. So when you contact the referee, make sure you do let them know that under the Privacy Act that the candidate can request a copy of the reference check as well. There are other options that you can actually outsource and pay for someone else to conduct for you, such as criminal checks, licence and qualification checks, and quite a few others, but that's probably for another conversation. Once you're through that, you're really down to making the offer. So make sure when it does come to the offer, usually I do this verbally first, and I would include some specific detail around the role, which would include their title and their remuneration package. Make sure if it is a package, you're clear about what that includes. Does it include super, or is super on top of what you're offering? Is there a bonus or any other benefits? I would talk to them about a proposed start date, but obviously knowing that they still need to give notice at that stage. Make sure you do follow up with any offer in writing using an applicable employment tool such as a contract or an agreement. For more complex roles, you might need to seek legal advice around developing that for you. The Fair Work website also has a number of templates around contracts and items that you need to include in a letter of offer.
One of the important components of the contract is to always include a trial period. That allows both parties to sort of get to know each other and determine whether or not each is right for the role, and also allows you some leeway in terms of ending that relationship. So that's one of the most important aspects.
And just don't forget, once you've got that offer out there, to go back to the candidates that you had shortlisted. So you would have already responded to the ones that didn't get an interview, or you would have worded your initial letter to indicate whether you would or would not contact them. But for the ones that you interviewed, I always recommend that they should get a personal phone call, just letting them know they've been unsuccessful. Oftentimes they will ask for feedback, so be prepared for that, and just remember that the feedback needs to be constructive. And don't break any of the legislation rules around discrimination either.
So now you've got the perfect person. You've asked them if they would like to work with you, and they've said a resounding yes. They've come on the first day. What do you do with them from that point on? And that's probably one of the most critical periods of time, those first few months, where expectation of that new employee is, as you've explained the role in the interview process, so you need to make sure that you follow through on all of those aspects. So day one, they're arriving. Probably one step before that is to let your existing team know that a new person has been appointed and who they are, and so that they can welcome them when they arrive. So in terms of that first day, you need to have that planned a little bit in advance so that you do know what you're going to do with the new employee once they start, because it's always a bit of an awkward time for everybody. We all have heard stories or probably experienced it ourselves where we've started a new role and, you know, somebody just says, oh, okay, here's your desk, and that's where it ends. So appointing a buddy or a mentor to that person is always a good idea. That just helps the person with the day-to-day activities and just the very basic questions that sometimes in a new role we feel like we're a bit silly in asking. You know, things like, where are the toilets? Or, you know, can I use anybody's cup in the kitchen? All those tiny little things that, you know, we don't give much notice to are quite important for a new employee. Even having a proper place for them to sit, to make sure all their computer equipment, their phone equipment, everything is set up, that they actually have a clean workspace to work at. You know, they're all very tiny things, but they make a huge impression on a first day. We've got also time should be set aside for a bit of an induction into the firm generally before they meet their team, and that is something that if you've got an HR specialist, they may be involved in that. Otherwise, you can appoint someone from the organisation to do that for them. From a training perspective, you of course would have an ongoing training plan which should have been organised before the person started. That gives a bit of a timeline and an expectation on what tasks should be learnt, and that will depend of course on the experience of the person, how long they've been in previous similar roles, and how specific the job is that you have engaged them to do. One of the things that we do here, which is something that I think a lot of our new candidates have commented on as being very positive, is that we set time aside, no matter what the role, for that person to meet with some of the key people. So everyone who starts here meets our Managing Director, David Rose. They also meet our HR Director, Paul Vincent, that they have time to sit and they chat with me as well. So it gives them that, yes, everybody does care, and that, you know, they're not just a little cog in the wheel. Most contracts, as we mentioned earlier, should include a trial period, and during that trial period it is important touching base with that person just to make sure that their expectations are being met, or alternatively, if there are areas or things that need to be addressed, they are discussed early, and then there are no sort of misunderstandings along the way. A lot of roles have got specific KPIs that need to be met. That also needs to be explained to the new employee as early as possible, so that there isn't any "I didn't know about that" conversations down the track. Now, culturally, all businesses are different from a cultural perspective, and hopefully the selection process that Terri went through has identified the person that's right for your culture, but there are always some underlying sort of ground rules that aren't sort of written in any policies or procedures, or articulated, you know, in a clear format. So what we need to do is, just try and include those in our discussions with our new employee. What days we have social functions, what the expectations are for social functions. It would be good also on the first couple of days to organise a morning tea or a welcome lunch for the new person as well. So that just flows through from the organisation's values and just reinforces those. Now, mentioned earlier the KPIs. Now, they need to be articulated in the first few days, but of course, as the job rolls on, then there are expectations where those people will need to actually start to meet those KPIs. It's very important that, as I said, they are discussed on the way around so that there are no surprises. In professional services, for instance, KPIs would be productivity percentages, billings versus budget, write-off percentages, gross profit per person, those kind of calculations. In a sales role, it would involve, of course, dollar value of sales. It could also involve new client touch points, conversion rates, those kind of things. Credit management may well be debtor days or cash collections versus budgets. There's a myriad of KPIs depending on the type of industry that you're in, and a lot of that can be sourced online or through industry associations. The communication of the communication process in any part of the engagement process is very, very important. So keeping them up to date with where things are going and what's happening with their role and with their team is extremely important. We would like to think that employees will stay with us for, more than a few years. So that is something that actually drives that. And over the years, that's something that comes up time and time and time again when we conduct our exit interviews, that communication may well has not been as good as it could be. There's something that we introduced here at Vincents as well, which is from a career planning perspective, because throughout the person's employment there are discussions that you will have over where that person would like to be. We have career planning meetings where our staff meet. We call it Career Week, and they discuss with our senior people, Managing Director and HR Director, in relation to where they see themselves in a few years. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it is with Vincents, it could well be with another organisation. So just sort of touching with them and caring about where they want to be is very important. Now, from time to time, we have some issues that personal issues that may spill into the workplace. So from a performance management issue, we need to know how to deal with those. And I mentioned at the introduction the challenges that are faced. Now sometimes they wrap around those kind of discussions. So knowing how to deal with them is very important. It's something that's sort of beyond this discussion today, but there are ways that we can plan those discussions so that it's worthwhile for both parties. So job coaching, we mentioned that along the way as well, that we need to keep in touch with everybody at different stages of their career, and we need to be open and frank about the discussions that we have. Providing feedback is important, but also it would be good for staff to provide feedback to us, and we need to encourage that to happen. You can do that through a multitude of ways in terms of just casual touch point discussions. You can also plan to have more structured surveys and have anonymous responses to surveys that provides good information, and you can have those from time to time and compare them to what the results were at the same time 6 months ago or 12 months ago. The way that we deal with situations such as flexible workplace requirements, a lot of that is legislated, but it's also a way of retaining good employees to be a little bit more flexible. And I think what we've seen more and more of now is, because of people's different lifestyles, flexibility is something that is very important to them. So generally speaking, there are little ways that you can make employees feel welcome and feel like they are really making a contribution. But of course, there are times when we do everything that we can, but for whatever reason, the employment arrangement ends. Terri will talk through some of these now.
So, as Christiane said, sometimes despite the level of engagement that we might have with an employee and vice versa, things happen. The individual might decide to accept another opportunity and resign from your business. Your own business might go through a restructure, and as such there might be some redundancies. Again, that's probably a rather large area that we'll save for another day, but just quickly to say there are a number of legal obligations around redundancy. Redundancies are always about the role and the role no longer being required. It's not a justification to remove someone from your business for performance purposes. That would mean that you need to have a performance review process in place, a performance management process in place, where you're meeting with them and discussing performance issues. So redundancy requires you to comply with the National Employment Standards, awards and agreements if they're in place. And as I said, they're about a role and not a person. If it comes down to performance issues, you'd instigate a performance management process. And we can talk about that in further details in a future session, or you can email myself or Christiane for specific information. Another area that crops up in terms of terminating employment would be an unsuccessful trial period or probation period. We mentioned earlier that that would be in everybody's contract when they first start with you. I would suggest you have key points during that trial period that you meet. We do ours usually at 3 months and 5.5 months, just to make sure everything is on track and that we're already identifying any concerns, if there are any, before we're reaching the end of the trial period. And there are some legal obligations around how to wrap that up as well that we can give you some advice on if that's applicable to your business. Turning around a resignation, from time to time, having a very quick discussion with someone who's resigned might identify some issues that hadn't come through. There could have been an engagement issue, and this may be an opportunity for you to address that. If the individual resigning indicates that it can be fixed, make sure that you do address it straight away, that the actual problem is addressed and resolved. In my experience, offering someone additional money to stay on board doesn't actually foster a longer-term commitment or contentment to your business. Oftentimes, if the original problem hasn't been addressed, it will still be there and it will come back around again. If there's no other way around stopping the termination of someone who's resigned, then I would certainly suggest an exit interview as a good tool to reflect on your relationship. There are a number of these exit interview templates available online, and you do need to make sure once you conduct the exit interview that you do take action on the feedback and reflect on the areas that they've suggested you can improve on. Once the decision has been made for someone to exit the business, the next important process is to make sure you communicate their exit with your business. Again, all part of your cultural process and your engagement is being fairly clear and transparent with people around what's happening. I typically don't specifically advise the reason why someone has decided to leave your business, because I find that can make it difficult later on if there is a performance issue and you actually terminate employment. I think that sometimes makes it difficult because for privacy reasons you couldn't share if someone's been terminated for performance issues. So at Vincents we state that this person's leaving and this is the date they're leaving. And if it's a good news reason why they're leaving because they've got a fantastic opportunity somewhere else, they can choose to share that with their peers.
One thing I think that some people do is take the resignation personally. The employer takes it personally. It certainly shouldn't be seen as a personal affront, because people do, have their own career paths, and sometimes they need to move to progress that path. So I think it's really, really important how we deal with people who do resign, because you can never say never, and we've had several instances where people have come back. So that's really important, to deal with them at the end stage of their relationship, just as with as much enthusiasm as you did when they first joined you.
And I guess you also just don't know what role they'll play in your future. They could be also a future client, or
yes, or referrer.
Yeah, or referrer of work as well.
That's true.
So then we move down to the final pay, so just making sure that you do calculate their final pay correctly. If your organisation has any policies that require employees to repay training components, make sure that you're letting them know what that repay figure looks like in advance, so that you can organise for that to be deducted from their pay with their authority, or engaging with them in terms of how they're going to settle that debt. On their last day, make sure you do retrieve all your business's property, so your keys, laptops, portfolios, their business cards. You should probably get those back as well. Any other merchandise that you might have shared and you don't wish for them to retain, and also notifying your IT person to make sure their access to your equipment is cut off on their last day. I think in keeping with, as Christiane said earlier, cultural processes, I think it's always lovely to have a nice farewell for that person, whether that's a lunch or an afternoon tea or morning tea, whether it's, depending on the size of your organisation, just something the immediate team participates in. That's up to your business, but I think a formal farewell where the owners or the big bosses of the organisation come and say goodbye to them is always appropriate as well.
So we're running a little bit over time, unfortunately, but as you can see, it's a huge topic, and it was a whirlwind overview of the main processes involved. There's a lot more that can be said around a lot of those topics, so we do welcome your feedback on areas where you would like more in-depth information, and Terri and I would love to present to you in the new year. So thank you everybody for joining us.